বাংলায় আমার জীবনানন্দ, বাংলা প্রাণের সুর। আমি একবার দেখি, বারবার দেখি, দেখি বাংলার মুখ। বাংলায় আমার জীবনানন্দ, বাংলা প্রাণের সুর। আমি একবার দেখি, বারবার দেখি, দেখি বাংলার মুখ।
শুভ সকাল, গুড মর্নিং সাসকাটুন। সবাইকে বাংলার গান ও কথা শোনার জন্য আমন্ত্রণ জানিয়ে শুরু করতে যাচ্ছি আমাদের আজকের অনুষ্ঠান। পৃথিবীর বিভিন্ন প্রান্ত থেকে আপনারা যারা এই মুহূর্তে রেডিও ছেড়েছেন আমাদের আজকের অনুষ্ঠান শুনবেন বলে তাদেরকে শুভেচ্ছা জানাচ্ছি। আমি জেবুন্নেসা চপলা। প্রিয় শ্রোতা, আমরা বাংলার কথা বলি, অভিবাসীদের জীবন সংগ্রাম ও জীবনযাত্রার মান উন্নয়নের কথা বলি, জনসচেতনতার কথা বলি এবং অন্তর বিকশিত করার কথা বলি। অভিবাসীদের জীবনযাত্রার মান উন্নয়নের ক্ষেত্রে আন্তঃসাংস্কৃতিক শিক্ষার গুরুত্ব অপরিসীম। শিক্ষা ও সংস্কৃতির সেতু বন্ধনের জন্য বাংলার গান ও কথা দৃঢ়ভাবে অঙ্গীকারাবদ্ধ।
দৃপ্ত স্লোগান, ক্ষিপ্ত তীর ধনু। আমি একবার দেখি, বারবার দেখি, দেখি বাংলার মুখ। বাংলায় আমার দৃপ্ত স্লোগান।
Dear listeners, March is Cultural Diversity and Race Relations Month. In 1966, the United Nations declared March 21st as the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination in commemoration of the 1960 Sharpeville massacre in South Africa, when peaceful demonstrators against apartheid were wounded and killed. In 1990, City Council proclaimed March as Cultural Diversity and Race Relations Month in the city of Saskatoon. Banglar Gaano Kotha is going to have series of shows at CFCR Community Radio to celebrate cultural diversity and race relations month. Dear listeners, Dr. Murray Battiste, who is a teacher, knowledge keeper, community activist, and university scholar, she documents the nature of Eurocentric models of education and their devastating impacts on indigenous knowledge. Battiste proposes a new model of education. She argues that the preservation of Aboriginal knowledge is an Aboriginal right and a right preserved by the many treaties with First Nations. Current educational policies must undergo substantive reform. She advocates for decolonizing education and anti-racist education. We are honored, excited, and happy to announce that Banglar Gaano Kotha is going to have an 1-hour radio show with this world-renowned indigenous scholar. Dear listeners, সুপ্রিয় শ্রোতা, আপনারা হয়তো ভাবছেন যে হঠাৎ করে ইংরেজিতে কেন কথা বলছি। হ্যাঁ, নিশ্চয়ই একটা কারণ আছে। কারণ আজকে আমাদের স্টুডিওতে একজন ওয়ার্ল্ড ফেমাস স্কলার রয়েছেন, যার সাথে আমাদেরকে ইংরেজি ভাষাতেই কমিউনিকেট করতে হবে। আর সুপ্রিয় শ্রোতা, আপনারা যারা হয়তো শুনছেন হয়তো ভাবছেন যে আজকের এই দিনের প্রয়োজনটা কোথায় এবং কেন আমরা আজকের এই অনুষ্ঠানটা করছি। সো সৃজিতা, ক্যান ইউ রিমেম্বার অন আওয়ার ওয়ে উই ওয়ার টকিং টু হ্যাভ দিস শো অ্যান্ড হোয়াট ইজ দ্য ইম্পর্টেন্স অফ হ্যাভিং দিস শো, রাইট? সো লেটস talk about that for our listeners.
Okay, sure. So the two major reasons why we wanted to have this show and invite you and have you speak on this. For the first time, in our part of the world, I come from India, and English is huge, as I was telling you. even if you don't know your mother tongue, or even if you cannot read or write your mother tongue, you flunk in your mother tongue, it's absolutely fine. But if you don't do well in English, or if you cannot speak English, your career is doomed. So, your mother tongue is disappearing, it's taking backstage. And my second thing, which is the theme of this entire show, that maybe because we were colonized by the British for long enough, I don't know why it is. It's a fad amongst the immigrant community, even those who come to this part of the world, to push their little ones to become a doctor or an engineer or a scientist. They cannot think anything beyond that. And when we say we are doing social science, they're like, come back again. Is that a subject? We get these kind of things. So what is your take on this, and
Right.
how do you look at it? So
Yeah.
these are the main two
Exactly.
broad things why we are conducting this show with you
Exactly.
today.
And also, Mari, a lot of newcomers are here. They have been living here maybe for 50 years or less than that or more than that. But as an immigrant woman, I have experienced that a lot of immigrant women do not have enough information to learn about the history of Canada, to learn about Aboriginal culture. So, and I would say that is the reason of having this show today. So, since you are a scholar, I know that you do talk a lot about heavy stuffs in the university, but today actually our show would be very conversational and to learn very easy way from you. You do a lot of advocacy for decolonization of education. So would you mind to let us know first, what's the meaning of decolonization of education?
Well, thank you very much. I'm so delighted to be here. And I think that to understand decolonization, and there's many different ways to understand decolonization. Largely, decolonization came through understanding how the countries around the world were coming out from the horrors of wars, and from which they began to get released from and freed from and independent from the British colonies, or from the British crown. And I admit that in my earlier days, I had so little understanding of the world around me. I was a First Nations child that had grown up under the colonial government of this Canada, very oppressive colonial government, for which during the years that my parents were living on reserve and in Nova Scotia, Canada, and they were working with what they could, working in the labor fields of my dad was working in the woods, cutting pulp. My mother was taking care of her children, and the way in which we supplemented our income at the time was by making baskets. And so basket making was something that our family did, and everyone did at the time, and it was a way to make your money, is to make these beautiful baskets and sell them for a dime. And today they're very much still people still have this talents for doing that, but the baskets are much more expensive these days. But my parents left the reserve in 1947, and it was, as usual, every year they went to work outside the reserve in potato pick and harvest in Maine. So potato pick and harvest was a time for about 3 or 4 weeks where they drew upon labor to get the harvesting all of the potatoes in, and my father and all kinds of the people went. But my mother had 3 children. And when my father said, I'm going to leave and go do this, she said, you're not going to leave without me. And so as I thought through this, my oldest sister, who was now of school age, my parents said, well, what are we going to do about our daughter who's going to school? If we go pick potatoes, there won't be a school nearby. We'll be in the woods and so on. and his sisters convinced him that they should send her to the residential school. So she was then taken to the Indian residential schools, where she ended up staying there for 3 years while my parents ended up being in Maine, trying to make a living, and that is where I was born. And at the age of 3 years old, I met my sister for the first time, who had spent 3 years in the residential school, wholly damaged by the experience of the Indian residential schools. And from that, we ended up staying in Maine during those continuing years. During those years, my family often came to visit us in our home where we lived on the border. And I noted as I was growing up that very few people went to school. They went probably to grade 5 or 6, and that was about the end of their education. And as I went through then 5 and 6 and imagined myself graduating grade 8 and maybe even possibly going to high school, I realized that there was a disparity in the way in which education in the United States was for people, as well as what my people, Mi'kmaq people, and other Maliseet people, how much education they were receiving. And as I looked at the situation as I grew older, I began to realize that education was a place where I could help contribute to the support and helping of my people through their education. And so I took that path, and as my years went on, and I graduated, my brother graduated from high school, my sister graduated from high school. We were among a very small number of people who were part of this community, this large community who were getting through high school. So as we look at the education system, and I back up a little bit to say that my father and mother had probably a 4th grade and a 3rd grade education, although my father was an avid reader, and he appreciated the every year that I was in school and relished in every A I brought home. And it was such a joy to have that and to be constantly applauded for every little tiny accomplishment that I made, that, you know, my accomplishments then continued to grow over the years, to the place where I ended up going. I taught in the University of Maine system for a couple years in a program during those early years that were working on disadvantaged youth. And from there ended up moving on to be recruited after a couple of years to go to Harvard. So I went to Harvard and I got a master's degree, and it was in that year that I had the first time that I ever had a course that was delivered by an Indigenous instructor. And I realized that all of my education had been a colonial education. Everything I had learned, I knew nothing about who I was. I was an English-speaking gal who spoke Mi'kmaq at home with my parents, but at the same time, I knew nothing about who I was. They didn't tell me who I was. And so the course that I took was a course that was to look at American Indians and the histories and the issues around education. And it exploded in my mind that something is here to take home. And through my own work in Harvard and graduating, and I met my husband, who was at Harvard Law School and was at that point taking on a legal case against Harvard University, because Harvard University was begun by a grant for Indigenous students. And the law library had the original bricks from the building of that original building that was built on an Indian grant. So he was taking Harvard Law School or Harvard education, Harvard University, through this law case, which would end up with them agreeing finally after many, many years to give scholarships to Indigenous students, for which he was able to make that happen. So that being a short end of the stick, but basically what I have found as I skipped through a whole lot of years and a whole lot of experience, but the experience of me was to say that education needs to be not a colonial experience, not an education experience of just the of a government that comes from another country that isn't even here, but it has to be a way to help people understand their situation, where they are, and how it is that they are in an inequitable situation. And that colonial decolonizing education, then for me, is for all of educators today, and I teach my classes to help people to understand that we have to understand where colonialism came from and how we're to understand it, but understand it from our own perspectives. And then the second part of that is that since colonial experience has taken everything away from our people and from all peoples, that we need to have a recovery. It has to be a renewal, a restoration of Indigenous peoples' identities, Indigenous peoples' languages, Indigenous peoples' experiences in Canada. And so my courses are built around those two pillars. One, to understand and unpack the colonial histories, as well as to unpack and to recover and restore all the things that we need to be Indigenous peoples in this country, which is ours, which has been built on treaties that have been signed and that had been ignored and marginalized for many, many years. So in a snapshot, I give you there.
Okay, that's an amazing way to put it. And I had a quick question to ask you, because you just spoke about, colonization and how it affected the language thing. I would try to get it to our part of the world, because we were British colonies and we have a lot of people coming from there to here, right? Mm-hmm. If you just go and see, the Indian and Bangladeshi immigrants topped the charts in right. US and in Canada. So my thing is there, Mary, how do you explain this particular thing, that how English has become the language in our part of the world, and how people literally they are looking down upon their own mother tongues, and they just don't care if you don't. And if you tell them, teach your kid the mother tongue, and it's a very rational argument that parents put forward, and I totally agree to this, that what are they supposed to do by knowing mother tongue? It's not going to get them a job. If they don't know English, you cannot put food on the table. So how do you decolonize that mentality, or tell them that this is not the way? Knowing your mother tongue is also not such a bad thing. You know right. what I mean?
Well, I go back to following after my Harvard years. I went then to Stanford University. And I began teaching, first of all, at the University of California in Berkeley, and decided to start doing my doctoral studies. And I took full-time studies at Stanford while I taught full-time at Berkeley. And my area was education, and my area at Stanford University was in the program called bilingual, bicultural, bidialectical education. Mm-hmm. So this then began for me to understand how and why one should have not just one language, but two or more. And one thing that became clear to me during those years was that those people who speak more than one language have far more intellectual capacity, capability, and intellectual, I called it epistemological stretching. That you're able to not only think and work in one language, but to think and work through two and more languages, that you have far more creativity, far more capacity to think outside the box, and so on. And so that concept of having a language and then adding a second language and then maybe even a third is now well developed theory of education about how we can learn better by learning many languages. What makes us impoverished is when we speak one language and it isn't our own. We get impoverished because we are learning another language to which often is not our home language, is often not the language of our communities. And so as a result, what happens is that our kids are functioning in a foreign language, in a foreign tongue, and they are impoverished already by that experience, but also they are not able to draw upon what is called their prior experiences. And the lack of that, having to be able to connect to those prior experiences, leads them to a second layer of dissonance, a cognitive dissonance that then continues to create problems in their later years. So they're always struggling. So a struggle throughout your lifetime, rather than to have a language on which you build and on which you then can easily go back and forth to and with, is the way that a bilingual education will go.
Marie, actually, we are here only for an hour, and I think I have so many questions to ask you.
Okay.
I'm very excited, but I think first question what I wanted to ask you, that is why decolonization of education is important for newcomers, and what do you think, how it's gonna empower them?
Oh, indeed.
Yes.
Well, I think that every newcomer that comes from some situation, whether they are refugees running away from a kind of an oppressive state, or whether they are coming from another country thinking that this is a place where they're going to develop, new attitudes, new skills, and new talents to become enriched by it. I think that everyone has an experience that they come from in which they can relate to what colonial histories are about and how they lead to oppression, how they lead to the certain groups of people who benefit from them, those who speak or are belonging to the colonial cultures. Those here are not just English, but also French in Canada. Mm-hmm. So English and French are the privileged languages here and are the ones that are used. And so people, think they're enriched by having the two languages of English and French, but they don't come with a notion that they should continue on with their own languages. So understanding the decolonial or the colonial experience is something that I think every newcomer can understand. And when they do, they understand the oppression that they've lived within in their own countries, and then understanding that decolonization is not just about understanding that and understanding the unpacking of whiteness and privilege that belongs with that kind of language, but they also get to understand their own relationship to that. And when they do so, then they are able to understand why in this country, Indigenous people's experiences have been the one that has been the colonial experience for this country. And they need to understand what that is, because often they come in with a very, they get drawn into the narrative here in Canada about Indigenous people. And that narrative is often a very negative one. So we need to have others come into the country to understand what the colonial experience is in this country to those people. And in so doing, it will help them understand how they come in and how they can be enriched by that experience as well.
You are contributing in this field internationally since long time. So what is your experience? What prevents us to receive decolonization of education?
Well, I would say that at present, our systems of education are deeply colonial. Even as we today are talking about decolonization or indigenization, or in the days past, they've talked about multicultural education and diversities and so on. But it is a system that continues to be steeped within the colonial British North American Anglo traditions. And so it's still yet very difficult to get people who are within the systems to understand what that means in terms of their own experiences and what they lacked and what they lost by not having that information. So my students today, when I'm working with them, and I bring them halfway through the course to an awareness of what decolonization is about, it's sort of like they cross over a door that they can never go back. It comes to a place where you begin to understand, I get it. Now the issue is, what do you get and what do you do about it? And so today we have some systems that are changing a little bit. We have more Indigenous scholars that are in the field, in education, even are in, superintendent positions. But they aren't MLAs, they aren't, in the government, they aren't heading up a lot of the places where the Education Act needs to change. I was talking with one of the former MLAs just this past week who said, well, why don't we just change the Education Act in Saskatchewan? And I said, yeah, let's do that. And he said, well, it shouldn't be a big thing to do. And so I'm going to follow up on that, because I think that could be a place where we could begin, is following and changing the act and then moving through the institutions. So we do have our university, for example, just had a reconciliation forum last week. But yet, at the same time as you bring in a lot of activity, it doesn't mean you're decolonizing. You can have a lot of activity that is still within a colonial mindset, and that still resides within the university. Part of it is when you say we should have a mandatory course in Indigenous peoples. In whatever discipline you are, you should have a course, and you select it. Well, there would be a whole lot of people who would say, well, why should I? Why do I need it for science?
Yeah, exactly.
Why do I need it for, if I'm going into law? Why would I need it if I'm, going to be a medical doctor? And for all those reasons, yes, there is a place for Indigenous people's experience in all those. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has said in their 94 calls to action that they should do that at all these levels, both at the levels of government, in the levels of law schools, medical schools, educations, broadcasting, media, and all these other places. But in terms of science, I think you mentioned earlier about science, and that is that Indigenous people's knowledge and experience on this land is one that is a very, very long educational experience. And that kind of knowledge needs to be brought together with the science that is built around observation and examination of patterns and noting patterns and so on. That is a scientific method. So bringing these together would enrich the sciences immensely. And it would also bring Indigenous peoples into sciences and through those particular places to be able to go back into their own communities, to have what I would call this two-way street of looking at education from multiple perspectives.
So as you just were talking, as I say in our thing, we just come out with new things all the time. As you were talking about this resistance or reconciliation, so do you think, is it a reconciliation, or are we developing really a resistance of what is going on in the Indigenous field, or are we reinforcing the idea of inequality in the same way, and whatever you think, how you think it kind of, because everything goes back to employment, and gaining employment, how you think this is attached to the area of employment?
Well, I think that if we've got a very long ways to go. Once we have our own people getting through school, like myself, I was among the first who came through in 1980, was it 84, when I got my doctorate degree. I was among the first Mi'kmaq with a doctorate. That didn't change until about 5 years ago when the second one came about. But to say, I think that we have places still where when people get through their education, and if they haven't had a colonial education but have had a decolonizing education, then it's easier to bring into wherever the workplace that they take their understandings to begin to operate differently from within those particular places. So I think that it makes the change. It makes the change in society. It makes the change throughout the world by doing these kinds of things, by having Indigenous scholars, activists, and other educated people who've had now an understanding of that decolonized mentality. They then can work much better within, as opposed to a resistance that occurred, say, in the 60s when everybody was out into the resistance mode and during the war in the United States, everybody was on the street, but we hadn't theorized yet feminism. We hadn't theorized yet, the whole issue of activism from within a theory of indigenized peoples. So, it's sort of like things went on, but it was through those years of dissonance that we got to a place where we began to theorize empowerment and theorizing the ways in which we can move in education. I think we're far better for it, but it just goes to show that it doesn't matter where you start, as long as you are in and are part of and can begin somewhere, you are in a place where you can, whether it is out there being an activist with your placard cards or whether you are in education. Some places are places where are better place for understanding what the experience that one has had, but understanding it from a different level.
Murray, you touched a little bit about the multiculturalism. So as a newcomer, I have been living here in this city around 7 years, and I took a part of multiculturalism a lot, and we are so proud of our own culture too. So celebrating Folk Fest and Heritage Festival a lot. But I have experienced from those festivals and from those celebrations that we hardly get the message about decolonization or hardly know about the colonization history of Canada. So my question is to you, why and how decolonization should come prior to diversity?
I think that diversity as a concept is just the acknowledgement that all of these things exist. The languages, the peoples, the wonderful fabric of culture that is inherently part of everyone's experience. What I think we have to be aware of is that how some cultures are privileged, acknowledged, and accepted, and even normalized, to the extent that one would ask someone who has brown skin and who speaks English and says, why is it that you have, how come you speak so well? And I mean, that would say that you didn't belong here, or that you weren't born here, or that you didn't have many generations here. And that is so wrong. But I think that what we have to continue to understand is that there is an awareness of certain groups that have been privileged over the years, and when they become aware of their own privileges, they begin to realize the inequities that have been developed through education, through the workforces, through the ways in which culturalism is applied. So cultures have been allowed to proliferate and to grow through multicultural activities, but they don't want them to be aware of their own inequities and how that is proliferated through privileging certain kinds of things in Canada. And I think that is the problem, that I think that each of the multicultural organizations need to understand their own situations in Canada and unpack those, and to be conscientized to that particular experience and resist it, and join with each other and with Indigenous people and other groups of people in order to help empower not just themselves, but all those who have been disempowered.
Marie, can we enjoy a song now?
Yes.
I think you need a little break. Which song? Do you have any preference?
No,
No?
I'll accept what you have.
All right, sure. Dear listeners, I have Buffy St. Mary here, and I heard that Universal Soldier, that's your favorite song.
Oh, yes. Thank you very
Let's
much.
enjoy together.
She's my dear friend, too.
The 60s for me was about alternatives and students. Students were saying what was on our mind. Everybody and his sister played a guitar, and we were talking to each other. Caffeine was the drug, and I think it was an incredible, incredible time of spontaneity and sharing and communication. They were trying to tell us, however, that there was no war in Vietnam, and a lot of us knew that there was, or we believed that there was. Now, there was a night when I was traveling, somehow I was stranded in San Francisco airport. And I had a morning flight on the way to Toronto, where I had an engagement in Yorkville at the Purple Onion, which was, kind of a hippie place, a student movement kind of center. And it was the middle of the night, and some soldiers came in, wheeling their buddies on stretchers and wheelchairs. And these guys, I'd never seen anything like that.
He fights with missiles and with spears. He's all 31 and he's only 17. He's been a soldier for 1,000 years. He's a Catholic, a Hindu, an atheist, a Jain, a Buddhist and a Baptist and a Jew. And he knows he shouldn't kill, and he knows he always will kill you for me, my friend, and me for you. And he's fighting for Canada, he's fighting for France, he's fighting for the USA. And he's fighting for the Russians, and he's fighting for Japan. And he thinks we'll put an end to war this way. And he's fighting for democracy, he's fighting for the Reds. He says it's for the peace of all. He's the one who must decide who's to live and who's to die. And he never sees the writing on the walls. But without him, how would Hitler have condemned him at Dachau? Without him, Caesar would have stood alone. He's the one who gives his body as a weapon to a war. And without him, all this killing can't go on. He's the universal soldier, and he really is to blame. His orders come from far away, no more. They come from him and you and me. And brothers, can't you see? This is not the way we put an end to war.
সুপ্রিয় শ্রোতা, আপনারা বাংলার গান ও কথা শুনছেন আমাদের সাথে। আপনাদের সঙ্গে রয়েছে আমি চপলা এবং সৃজিতা, এবং আজকে স্টুডিওতে আমাদের অতিথি রয়েছেন ডক্টর মারি ব্যাটিস্ট। শি ইজ আ রিনাউন্ড ইন্ডিজিনাস স্কলার, এবং শি ইজ শেয়ারিং দ্য স্টোরি হাউ শি ডেভেলপড অ্যান ইন্টারন্যাশনাল প্রোফাইল ফর অ্যাডভান্সিং দ্য decolonization of education, the development of indigenous voice and vision, anti-racist education as violence prevention, and the institutionalization of the indigenous humanities, science and knowledge. যাই হোক সুপ্রিয় শ্রোতা, আমরা শুরু থেকেই আজকে মারির সাথে কথা বলছি, শুনছি তার আলোচনা এবং তার বক্তব্য। Now we have a listener here, dear listeners. I'm going to introduce with him. So Arif is here. Arif, would you mind to share a couple of sentences about yourself first?
Thanks, Chopola, for arranging this sort of conversation here. My name is Arif. I am from biomedical engineering. I am doing PhD here, and today I was listening to Mary. She's awesome. She's whatever she's explaining is pretty impressive. So I have just one question to her. Earlier she was saying if we can introduce some coursework in the university level or education level that might help people understanding our problem. So my question is that if we introduce one or two courses, is that enough to make changes in our conception or in the society, or we can think about from the elementary school? Thanks.
Yes, thank you. Well, I would say that at this university is at Saskatchewan, there was a group of Indigenous faculty members. There's about 50 of us who got together, and we begin to think about and contribute to the conversation about indigenization and put together a definition. And that definition has gone through our group as what we think indigenization is, and we've given it to the university, to which now the University Senate has approved it. While they're still going through and collecting information from Indigenous students as to what their understanding is, one of the things that is part of that is for all faculty, all units, to understand what the colonial experience has been, understand what treaties have been in this country, and how those are the foundations of an education for all students in Saskatchewan. And we are encouraged by the fact that this president has set out to among his 4 eyes, eyes to innovate and so on. One of them is to indigenize. And he has been working with the various units in this university, as well as we're going to have in the fall of this year a vice provost who is going to be working in Indigenous engagement, whose responsibilities will be to bring that indigenized definition and push it throughout all the units. And so every unit, every college, every dean is now looking toward that particular kind of thing. And I think we're at a cusp of a very interesting new change in this university. And it's been growing and changing, and we've been leading this pack of universities across Canada. I remember talking about things we did, and one said, "What do you guys eating over there or drinking that you have such you are so progressive in this particular area?" And I think that it's been a long term, about I would say 25 years that we've been working on indigenization in its small form, but now it's moving in a much larger way.
Dear listeners, I think we don't have enough time to go on, but Srijita, you had a question, so maybe we can wrap up with that.
So my last question is, because this is a very immigrant-specific show, so I would like you to answer a question. So generally what happens, the part of the world that we come in, maybe because we were colonies, parents, and even if they come here, they force their kids to become scientists, doctor, or engineers, right? And if you tell them I'm a social science student, they are like, come back again? What is that subject? At the university I have seen this. So I would want you to tell us that how do you think this mentality can be broken through decolonization of education, that, being the doctor or the engineer doesn't mean the end of the world?
Well, I think part of it is that there's been a tradition that has said that if you have those kinds of professions, you get more money, and the more money you get, the more money you give back to your family. Correct?
Yeah.
So it's more about where are the big paying jobs today, and how do you get it, and how do you give back to your community, how do you give back to your family. And I would say that more importantly at this place in our time is that we need to find and build an education that will improve not only our stature in terms of our economy, but I think we need to improve our awareness of ourselves and our awareness of each other. And that has to be part of the social sciences, when we understand our own humanity and how to be a better humanity, and how we can utilize those kinds of good values and understanding of those to build a better society in which we live. I don't believe scientists do that. I don't think that sciences, even good jobs, do that. I think that what they do is they proliferate a mentality of destroying the land, the water, the earth. And I think that our world in the future is going to be depending upon a better awareness of the social sciences than the sciences.
High five to that. That's all I can say.
Thank you so much, Marie, for your time and effort to come to our studio early in the morning in this snow-falling weather. So, Srijita, so let's thank to Marie by clapping our hands. Thank
Yeah.
you so much once again.
And it
thank
was a
you.
very, very informative and
Exactly.
rich discussion, and I took back a lot of things today.
And
So
thanks
thank
to
you,
Arif too, and our technical supporter Ranjan Datto. And before we go home,
Yeah, sure.
Srijita, can we try to make one sentence? What do you learn about
Yeah.
decolonization of education?
Sure.
Let's try in English and Bengali both.
Okay, so as far as decolonization of education, what I learned, what Mary told us, that it is always important. Decolonization of education opens your mind. It opens your mind to the fact that how you have been oppressed for long and how you have never identified what you are as a person, right? And another great thing that I learned from your interview today, that it is always important to know more than one language, because that makes you more creative as a person. And so no language is better than the other. They are equally good. And finally, the importance of social science, where social scientists or people who are taking up social science are much more conscientious in certain ways, and hence I urge everybody to encourage their kids to take social science. And in Bangla, I would just say in a very short thing, so decolonization of education বলতে শ্রোতা উনি বোঝালেন যে নিজের ভাষাটাকেও ভালোবাসা, নিজেরা আমরা কোত্থেকে আসছি নিজেকে চেনা জানা, ইংলিশ শেখা খারাপ নয়, কিন্তু সাথে সাথে নিজের ভাষাটাকে জানলে, নিজের ঐতিহ্যটাকে জানলে আমরা এটা বুঝতে পারি যে কি করে আমাদের ব্রেন খোলে। দ্বিতীয় কথা উনি বললেন যে দুটো ভাষা জানলে মানুষের ব্রেন ইন্টেলেক্ট ক্যাপাসিটি খোলে। আর ফাইনালি উনি বললেন সোশ্যাল সায়েন্স পড়লে একটি কনসিয়াসনেস ডেভেলপ হয়, যেটা আমাদের ফিউচার ওয়ার্ল্ডে খুব লাগবে। তো এই তিনটেই আমার
Exactly. আমি যদি আরেকটু বলি, what I have learned from her discussion when she was in Harvard, মনে আছে উনি বললেন যে for the first time indigenous স্কলারের সান্নিধ্যে এসে she learned who she is. আমার মনে হয় যে সেটা খুব ইম্পর্টেন্ট একটা বক্তব্য, যে কলোনাইজড ওয়েতে আমরা যেই ভাবনাগুলো শিখে এসেছি, আমরা জানি না যে রিলিজিয়ন কেমন করে কলোনাইজড হয়েছে, আমরা জানি না যে আমাদের কালচার, ফুড, আমাদের থট প্রসেস কেমন করে কলোনাইজড হয়েছে। তো ওই জিনিসগুলোকে ভাঙতে পারার জন্য, just to break down all of those colonized thoughts, the education we need, that's called decolonization of education. That's what my understanding. If I'm wrong, never mind. So dear listeners, I'm really in a hurry. Our next host is already here. So before I go home, I have one announcement for you. So there is a lecture series is going on campus, New Feminist Research Lecture Series. The title of the lecture is The Impacts of Settler Colonial Violence on Indigenous Women. It will be on Wednesday, March 15th, 7 p.m. Gordon Oaks Red Bear Aboriginal Student Center at UFS. সবাই ভালো থাকুন, সুস্থ থাকুন। কথা হবে আবারও আগামী অনুষ্ঠানে নতুন কোনো বিষয় নিয়ে, এবং নতুন কোনো বক্তাকে আমরা আমাদের স্টুডিওতে আনবার চেষ্টা করব। তো সে পর্যন্ত আর কি, বাংলার গানের কথা শুনতে থাকুন এবং আমাদের সান্নিধ্যে থাকুন। চপলা বিদায় নিচ্ছি।
বাই, সবাই ভালো থাকবেন। সৃজিতা বাই বললাম।
বাই।
You're not a dream, you're not an angel, you're a man. And I'm not a queen, I'm a woman, take my hand. We'll make a space in the lives that we planned. And here we'll stay until it's time for you to go. Yes, we're different, worlds apart, we're not the same. We laughed and played at the start like in a game. You could have stayed outside my heart, but in you came. And he'll stay until it's time for you to go. Don't Now I'm a willow, now I can bend life. See you again.
CFCR, Community Events Magazine, is proudly brought to you by Affinity Credit Union. By supporting initiatives that promote affordable housing, youth, arts, and culture, Affinity is committed to building strong communities. CFCR, Community Events Magazine, is proudly brought to you by Affinity Credit Union. By supporting initiatives that promote affordable housing, youth, arts, and culture, Affinity is committed to building strong communities. CFCR, Community Events Magazine, is proudly brought to you by Affinity Credit Union. By supporting initiatives that promote affordable housing, youth, arts, and culture, Affinity is committed to building strong communities. CFCR, Community Events Magazine, is proudly brought to you by Affinity Credit Union. By supporting initiatives that promote affordable housing, youth, arts, and culture, Affinity is committed to building strong communities. CFCR, Community Events Magazine, is proudly brought to you by Affinity Credit Union.
Hello everyone and welcome to Community Events Magazine on CFCR 90.5 FM. It's this time of year again, time to join Saskatoon artists for the 26th Annual Artists Against Hunger Art Auction, all in support of CHEP Good Food, and it takes place on Saturday, March the 18th at TCU Place. For tickets and more details, please visit chep.org, that's chep.org website. The Kidney Foundation is holding its door-to-door fundraising campaign this March, so please do give generously and or become a volunteer for the organization. Learn more at kidney.ca/sk website. On Tuesday, March the 21st, mark the International Day for Elimination of Racism by attending City of Saskatoon's Living in Harmony Award ceremony happening at the Broadway Theatre between 10 a.m. and 12 noon. For more information, please visit saskatoon.ca website. The Meewasin Pelican Watch Contest is on. Guess the date on which the first pelican arrives in Saskatoon and win some great prizes. You can enter at meewasin.com website. And in recognition of its 25th anniversary, the Saskatoon chapter of the Alliance for Equality for Blind Canadians will be hosting an open house on Saturday, March the 18th, between 1 and 4 p.m. at North Saskatchewan Independent Living